Morning, everybody. It's good to be with you all. Um, Happy to have a chance to speak to you. We've been away for quite a bit, as some of you know. So it's really good to be back with everybody and to see you all and understand how we're getting on. We're here this morning to talk about another in our series of actually having things that we can do. And the story I want to talk about is Jonathans Armour Bearer from 1 Samuel this morning. It's a slightly complicated story, so I'm going to tell the story first. I'm going to put it on screen, so if anybody wants to look at the slides afterwards, they can see them. I'll put it on screen and we can read through it, a couple of words of explanation. Then I want to take some lessons from it that we can learn for ourselves, and hopefully that will be useful to everybody. So here we go. We'll see how we get on. At various stages, there are some questions I ask. You're very welcome to stop the video at those stages and think about the questions. I've also put them all at the end if you prefer to stop the video at the end and talk about them there. So we'll see how it goes. So, Jonathans Armour Bearer. This is a story about a time in the history of the nation when there were real troubles. And Saul had just become king, and Jonathan, his son, was around. So let's tell the story. Saul was king, and Jonathan was his son. The Philistines had been oppressing the country. As an example, there were no blacksmiths allowed in the land for fear that they would make swords or spears. So whenever they needed to sharpen their plow blades, picks, axes, or sickles, they had to take them to a Philistine blacksmith where they were charged for the privilege. None of the people had a sword or a spear except for Saul and Jonathan, two swords in the whole of the nation. This story took place in the hill country of Bethel, a territory crisscrossed with deep and impossible ravines. There's a picture here that gives you a feel for the kind of territory that they were talking about, although it looks a lot less severe from the air than it does on the ground. Jonathan attacked and defeated the Philistine garrison on the south of the gorge. It was the main pass. This is the main pass going down here that we'll refer to quite a lot. And there was a garrison in this area. Jonathan attacked and defeated it. And that pass that we've just shown you going across here was the only practical way to get through the area. And this gorge here has got precipitous crags on either side, and the Philistines occupied this high ground above it. And as we all know, in war situations, high ground is quite important. The fact that Jonathan had attacked and defeated the Philistines enraged them, and both armies called their troops. The Philistines had as many chariots as Israel had soldiers. I'm not quite sure what they thought chariots could do in that kind of terrain, but nevertheless. And each chariot had two charioteers, and in addition, there were more warriors than could be counted. And Saul's armies had only two swords. Quite a disparity. No wonder then that Saul's soldiers, who had been summoned from all over the country, saw that their situation was critical and that their army was hard pressed, and therefore hid in caves and thickets among the rocks and in pits and wells. Some even crossed the Jordan to enemy land, others joining the Philistines themselves and defecting to the enemy. The ones remaining with Saul were trembling with fear. Saul was waiting for Samuel, the high priest, to come and offer a sacrifice, but as Samuel was delayed and his men were scattering, he decided to make the sacrifice himself, which really wasn't allowed. And when Samuel arrived, he prophesied Saul's replacement by somebody that the Lord would select, who in due course turned out to be David. Following this, Saul retreated to his hometown a bit further south, with only 600 soldiers remaining. And if you want to have a look, there's Saul's hometown down there, and this is that deep gorge in the pass that we were talking about just a minute ago. And Jonathan and his troops remained south of that main pass, and the Philistines camped to the north of the pass. And from there, they sent out raiding parties in three directions: west, north, east. And meanwhile, the pass had been secured by a contingent of the Philistine army. So they had an outpost there to make sure it was secure. So they were camped somewhere around this place called Michmash, and they'd secured this high ground here that we just saw photographed from the air to secure this pass that was going across there. One day, Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Come on, let's go over to where the Philistines have their outpost." But he didn't tell his father what he was doing. So again, another picture. Here's the pass that was the only real practical way of getting through the area. This is the very deep gully that separated Jonathan over here from the Philistine outpost over on this high ground. And Jonathan was encamped a little bit further south here. No one realized that Jonathan had left the camp. To reach the Philistine outpost, he had to go down between two rocky cliffs, these ones, that were called Bozez and Seneh. The cliff on the north was in front of the Philistine outpost, and the one on the south was in front of Jonathan's encampment. Let's go across to the outpost of those pagans, Jonathan said to his armor bearer. Perhaps the Lord will help us. Oh, can you imagine? Perhaps the Lord will help us, for nothing can hinder the Lord. He can win a battle whether he has many warriors or only a few. And here's this amazing response from his armor bearer. Do all that you have in mind, the armor bearer replied. Go ahead. I am with you, heart and soul. We'll say a little bit more about the armor bearer in a few minutes. All right, then, Jonathan told him, we will cross over and let them see us. If they say to us, stay where you are or we'll kill you, then we will stop and not go up to them. But if they say, come on up and fight, then we will go up. That will be the Lord's sign that he will help us defeat them. When the Philistines saw them coming, they shouted, oh, look, the Hebrews are crawling out of their holes. Then the men from the outpost shouted, Jonathan, come on up here and we'll teach you a lesson. Come on, climb right behind me, Jonathan said to his armor bearer, for the Lord will help us defeat them. One sword between them, climbing up to an outpost, which was manned by probably around 20 men. So they climbed using both hands and feet. So here's Jonathan's encampment. That's that deep gorge. That's the pass that was the practical way. That was the main Philistine garrison. This was the Philistine outpost, and they were crossing from one side to the other across that gorge. Come on, climb right behind me, said Jonathan to his armor bearer, for the Lord will help us defeat them. So they climbed up using both hands and feet. That tells you how steep it was. They had to use hands and feet to climb, and the Philistines fell before Jonathan and his armor bearer killed those who came behind them. They downed some 20 men in all over about a half an acre. That's with one sword between them. Were they throwing the sword between them? Were they use other things? Did they nick the swords off the Philistines? We don't know. Suddenly, panic broke out in the Philistine army, both in the camp and in the field, including even the outposts and raiding parties, which were further northeast and west. And just then, an earthquake struck, and everyone was terrified. So we'll come into the end of the story now. Saul's lookouts saw a strange sight. The vast army of the Philistines began to melt away in every direction. While Paul was hesitating, talking to the priests, the confusion in the Philistine camp grew louder and louder. So Saul said, never mind, let's get going. Then Saul and all his men rushed out to the battle and found the Philistines killing each other. There was terrible confusion everywhere. Even the soldiers who had previously gone over to the Philistine army revolted and joined in with Saul, Jonathan, and the rest of the army. Likewise, the soldiers who were hiding in the hills joined the chase when they saw the Philistines running away. So the Lord saved them that day, and the battle continued to rage, even in the land to the west. So, what can we learn? What can we learn? How does the story of a battle that took place in the 11th century BC, that's 3,100 years ago, just at the end of the Bronze Age, how does that relate to us now in Surrey, in the UK, with modern technology? What can we learn? I've just got 4 things I want to suggest that we might be able to take away from this story. The first thing is there's a time to say, enough is enough, and it's time for a change. Enough is enough, and it's time. That's resolve. You see, Saul had accepted the Philistines' incursion into his kingdom. He was the king. He was supposed to protect that kingdom. He'd attacked them, but he hadn't followed through when they were on the run. And he was now back in his hometown, relaxing under a pomegranate tree. And all his remaining troops were quaking with fear. They were absolutely terrified. Very interesting that in the Old Testament, the pomegranate is a symbol of Israel's prosperity and comfort. In fact, the priests used to have a ring of pomegranate images around the hem of their gown. And there was Saul, if I can summarize it, he was sitting under the symbol of prosperity, watching it being taken away by the enemy. Jonathan, on the other hand, was in another place with a number of troops facing up to the enemy whilst the Philistines were gaining ground. He was still waiting for a command from the king, but he became increasingly frustrated with the status quo, and he resolved to act and to do something. He resolved not to accept the enemy's incursion into his kingdom, where he'd come to kill, rob, and destroy. So you've got a contrast between Saul and his son Jonathan. One accepted the status quo, the other one said, no, enough is enough. So I've got questions for us. What is my kingdom for me as an individual, or our kingdom as a community? What's the area that I should be protecting for me, my family, my community, that makes a difference, where the enemy might be getting an incursion? Where is Father prompting us to say enough is enough and resolve for us to take action? If you want to pause now, you're welcome to, or you can wait until the end. Second thing is the risk for Jonathan was huge. He had to resolve to do something, but boy, what was the risk? There was the territory. This is a picture at the bottom of the cliffs that he would have to climb up. They are really sheer. You can understand why they said using hands and feet to get up there. It was tiring. It was hard work. There was risk to fall, and they were coming up from the lower ground. And we all know, if you've all watched The Guns of Navarone, the film, you'll know that getting up to a high place when you're an attacking army is really tough, which is why they often put castles and other things on high places, parapets and moats and all the other things in the way. Secondly, they had one sword between them, and presumably little or no armor if they weren't allowed to have blacksmiths around. It's unbelievable that the risk he took in doing that. They were hugely outnumbered. There were two of them, and there were a lot in the garrison in the outpost, but their own troops were a lot less than the Philistine troops as well, and they were paralyzed with fear anyway. And no one knew they were there. They went on the quiet without letting anybody know. So there was nobody to come and rescue them if they didn't come back. And that included without Saul's knowledge and blessing. And there was a risk for Jonathan not going with his dad's blessing, and for the armor bearer, even more a risk of going against the king's will. Huge risks. And what was the basis they went on? Perhaps the Lord will help us. He went on the basis of perhaps. That was incredibly brave. And Jonathan proposed using the enemy's response as God's guidance, so that at least God could redirect them if he needed to. But what was the armor bearer supposed to do? Armor bearers actually carried spare weapons for the person they were bearing armor for. It was really strictly translated from the Hebrew. It should be armory bearer or weapons bearer. They used to carry spare swords and spears, because you can imagine if you've thrown a spear, you can't always go and get it back, and a sword might get broken or blunted. So they carried the spare weapons. He had nothing. He was unarmed going into battle. Had absolutely nothing to take with him. What was his contribution? Why was he there? But his response was, do all you have in mind, go ahead. I'm with you, heart and soul. Can you imagine what that meant to Jonathan? Deciding he was going to go and take this amazing action to have somebody like his armor bearer. He said, yeah, I'm right with you. I'll be right there. Don't worry. We all know that at the moment, Father's calling us afresh to take territory back from the enemy, both in our lives and in our communities, in our nation. And part of that is getting out there and taking a risk. So, do I act on the basis of probability of success like Saul did? Do I act on the basis of faith like Jonathan did? Jonathan's was really quite a huge faith, and it was just a perhaps. How do I let Father redirect me? How am I going to hear from him? What am I going to be saying that allows him to say, well, okay, pal, you've done okay so far, but we need to push you this way or that way a little bit. There's lots we could say about that, but you might like to have a think about that. Is perhaps God will help us enough for me? Is perhaps God will help me enough for me to support others? I remember a few years ago when Mark Blythe set out on his ministry in sport and decided to go full time and live on faith, it could have been seen as foolhardy, and there was no guarantees. And I think maybe if I can interpret what Mark was saying, and he can take me to task on this if I'm wrong, but he was saying, well, perhaps the Lord will help us in this. I think he had faith that that would happen, but we never know. And it's perhaps, and others got behind him and supported him and supported him in prayer, supported him financially, supported him in other ways to get on with that task. It's the kind of thing that we need to take. So you might want to pause now or do it later to think about those questions about how this affects me. Thirdly, there's a resolve to take a risk, and then there's the result. And Jonathan and his armor bearer experienced not a little. They had hardship climbing up with their hands and feet. Can you imagine how sore your hands and feet would be after climbing up those kind of cliffs and then going into battle? They experienced uncertainty. They'd said, perhaps God will help. Yes, they'd responded to what the enemy said, and they'd said, God, if they say that, I'll do this. And so their uncertainty was mixed with faith, but it was still uncertainty. They experienced mocking about, oh, these Hebrews, they're crawling out of their holes. Come on up, we'll teach you a lesson. Can you imagine the kind of way that the Philistines would speak to an enemy? And they were fighting with one sword between them, for goodness sake. Absolutely unbelievable what they faced. But their action set in train God's intervention on their behalf. A wonderful, wonderful spiritual principle here that sometimes when we are prepared to act, we will set in train God's intervention. There is a story that Jesus told about somebody that came to him and was healed, and he told them to go and report to the priests, and it says, as he went, he was healed. There's the story of the Old Testament where a servant was sent to find a wife for his master's son. And the master says, well, how did you find her? And he said, well, as I was in the way, as I was going, the Lord led me. You've got Naaman, who wanted to be healed of leprosy in the Old Testament. And he was told to bathe in the Jordan and hightailed it off saying, I'm not bathing in that filthy river. But his servant persuaded him to come back. And as he did it, God's intervention was released. So there's a great principle here that we need to learn from. And because God's intervention was released on their behalf, they destroyed the outpost with one sword, and panic ran right through the Philistine army. And it was an enormous army, many thousands of people. And they destroyed themselves. And God even added in an earthquake for some extra fun. Forgive my slight tongue-in-cheek there, but you know, it was just yet another thing that happened. And the rest of the Philistine army tried to escape for their lives. Our action in faith to take territory back from the enemy will free Father's heavenly power to act on our behalf. This is not about presumption. This is about going on the basis perhaps God will help us, we'll trust him, and we'll let him redirect us if we're getting it wrong. But acting will release God's power, provided we're acting with right attitude and right approach, and not trying to claim benefit for ourselves. There is nothing as powerful or fearful for the enemy as what we speak out. When we declare this far and no further, when we say enough is enough, there is something that in those words strike fear to the enemy's heart and will release God's power to intervene on our behalf. So can I trust, Father, to multiply the effects of my small resolve and risk? And it is small, but God can do that with very, very little. You've got loads of stories in the Old Testament. You've got the story of the widow with a little bit of grain and oil, and the prophet came and told her, you know, get loads of jars, start pouring, and it didn't pour until she ran out of jars. Lots of examples like that where God takes the little and multiplies it. The loaves and fishes is another example. And if God does that, will I acknowledge his intervention? Saul promoted himself and suggested it was all his doing and got into real difficulties as a result. And the fourth thing, we've had resolve, risk, result, release came out of it. Because of Jonathan and his armor bearer and their actions, many, many more released to action. They came out of hiding. They returned from the places they'd escaped to. They returned from the enemy where they'd defected because they'd lost heart and lost vision. Right and just action can inspire right and just actions. It's very true and equally true these days. And his armor bearer went with him. Now, I can imagine many of the people who heard about this story thought, well, Jonathan the Prince, that's one thing. But just an ordinary armor bearer without any weapons at all? Maybe if he could do it, I could do it. Could my action be what releases others? Can I support somebody else who's got faith to take a risk? I may not be in that position to be able to take that risk, but I can get in behind somebody else and say, yeah, do all that's in your heart. I'm right behind you. Heart and mind and soul and everything. He could have said, what's the point? I've got no weapon. Absolutely, I'll be a hindrance, not a help. I've got absolutely nothing to contribute. I don't have anything to carry. My role in life isn't there. What am I going for? Truth is, it doesn't matter. What we do is we go to support the person and we use what skills we do have. And actually, when we get into it, we may find that there are things that come to hand that we never expected. So we can be an armor bearer, even if we don't feel we can be a Jonathan. We can be an armor bearer where we can actually, by taking that action, find that other people are able to identify with us more than a person who's actually had the faith to take the action and feel it releases them to move into these things. So, in my life, can I say, perhaps Father can help me take back what the enemy robbed from me? Maybe relationships, confidence, self-esteem, history that has come back to you over and over again. All kinds of things that we feel the enemy's robbed from us. Can we say, perhaps Father can help me take back from the enemy some of those things? Perhaps Father can help me stop a damaging family cycle. Perhaps God can change my financial circumstances. And who can I have as an armor bearer to support me? Who would come on this journey with me and would say, yeah, I'm right with you, heart and mind? Who can I support as an armor bearer, even if I don't feel I've got the skills, so that I can see others released because they've seen this example? Can I believe that Father will multiply the results of my tiny resolve and risk so that it releases others into action? We've been talking a lot about church, about getting out there and doing things. I'm quite sure if you're anything like me, you think, oh, I'm not sure I'm exactly in that place. I'm a bit concerned about it. I'm not very good at doing this kind of thing and all the rest of it. Yeah. Can we be an armor bearer? We may not have the sword, the equipment, the skills, but maybe we can support somebody who we trust and we can move out with. So there's some things there for us to consider out of that story. I've put them up there again. I'm going to just leave those on screen for a little while, and then you can decide if you'd like to have a look at those and see how you'd like to discuss them. I'll leave that with you, but thanks for listening. It's an amazing story. It's one I can remember growing up with many, many years ago, and there's some real challenges for us, even in this 20th century, so many years later. Great to talk to you. I'm going to shut up now and let you think about these slides.